Welcome back to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got the whole crew with us, Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk, on this Tuesday afternoon as the Bulldogs go through a bye week. Georgia is in the middle of its second and final bye week of the regular season, coming off a huge win in Austin and getting ready for a big trip down to Gainesville. A lot to get into on this episode, recapping that Texas win, the timing of this bye week, how big this is for Georgia. A look at the SEC with Georgia getting that big win and reasserting itself as a contender in the conference. Some recruiting news, and we'll wrap it up with some UGA men's basketball talk. But guys, let's start with that win at Texas, 30-15. Huge win, plenty of controversy, plenty of big moments. Ben and I talked about it live probably an hour or so after the game on Saturday night. I would encourage folks who missed that, go check that out. I thought that was a really good episode, and I tweeted this on Sunday. I went back and listened to it, mainly, not just because I just totally love hearing myself talk. I always love doing that, but to just try to comprehend what the hell we watched, because it was a wild game. But fellas, let's talk about what has sort of stood with us and stuck with us since that time. I'll start with you, Kipp, because you weren't on that podcast. A few days removed now from that game, more time to go back and rewatch it. What still sticks with you about how that game played out? Anything in particular that's still kind of front of mind for you?
Well, defensively, I think what stands out is just the difference being healthy makes. And how we talked about before this season, this defense is going to go as far as its front seven can take them. How, are they going to get back to the playing that championship caliber defense by causing havoc and forcing quarterbacks to make quick decisions and completely shutting down the run, using that front seven, not having to use extra guys. And yeah, I mean, getting a guy back healthy like Mykel Williams helps. It opened everything up for Jalen Walker. It allowed him to play spy a lot as well. But also just Warren Brinson. I overlooked him completely in the game balls. Just the impact, having him healthy, him winning one-on-one battles, taking on blockers, and the trickle-down effect that has just on the rest of the defense. I mean, having Brinson back allows Christian Miller to play fresh, play to his strengths. Allows Nazir Stackhouse to be fresher as well. And I think that's where you can kind of see the ceiling of Georgia's defense rise by having these guys out there on the field and seeing, what Georgia's defense, what they probably thought they were going to have going into the season. And, offensively, Carson Beck has to get his confidence back. He went out there and we can't talk about, I know on TV they're going to talk about it every game, but you can't talk about Brock Bowers or Ladd McConkey not being here anymore. We're over halfway through the season. Those guys aren't coming through, coming out of the tunnel anymore. And yeah, you don't have Ra Thomas or Colby Young, but you do have Dominic Levitt. You do have Dylan Bell. These guys are not new faces. And even with, some inconsistencies, you do have Arian Smith. That's the biggest game breaker in the pass catching room. And goodness, he got lost and lucky. I mean, you have guys that you can make plays with. And it's pretty clear that Mike Bobo is going to use the pass to set up the run. That's, how they see this going, because they still threw the ball 41 times, even when it wasn't working. And so I kind of looking back on that, and during the game, everyone's like, why isn't Trevor Etienne getting the ball more? That's like the initial reaction, but he's averaging 19 touches per game in conference play. He's basically averaging what he did last year at Florida. I think this might be just what the staff sees, like as far as whether it's practice GPS numbers or something else that makes them feel like that's his sweet spot to keep him healthy and explosive. So I think that, that's just how his usage is going to be moving forward. So for that aspect of Georgia's offense, it just kind of seems to me that you see what they are missing from not having Branson Robinson and Roderick Robinson out there to just kind of, wear defenses down and for them to be able to lean more on the ground game. So I think the offense might just be what what we're seeing now. That might just be what this team is.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head, Kipp, and that's sort of, I'm working on my rewatch story. If you're watching this live, it's going to come out Tuesday afternoon. But to me, a lot of the way they used Trevor, and maybe didn't use Trevor, to me felt like self-preservation, not only for as that game wore on, but we're still only in October. They're going to need number one to take a lot of carries going forward, and not having Branson for the time being, probably not having Roderick Robinson for this season. I mean, they are very limited in what they can do. I do think that Trevor deserves a ton of credit. I mean, he's just such a natural playmaker. I mean, there were a few times in that game where he's in the hole and the blocking in front of him is subpar at best. And he just makes a natural little cut and turns probably a 2-yard run into like a 6-yard run. And those yards add up. Some of the other things stood out to me. You mentioned Arian Smith. Thought he played well. I mean, we talked about this Saturday night. If he doesn't make that catch on, I think, 3rd and 10 on the drive following Texas's touchdown, following the trash on the field and the overturned penalty, I don't think Georgia wins the game. Great play there. Aaron also did a very good job sorting that extension of the run that Kirby talks about, catching screens and turning those into plays. And then, too, Kirby talked about this on Saturday night, too. After that Arian Smith catch that I just mentioned, credit to Mike Bobo for calling that little reverse back to Carson that gets Oscar Delp wide open. I think that went for 20-something yards. I mean, that's kind of a gutsy decision there. And if it doesn't work, man, you look real dumb. And it worked. And it was a huge part of not only getting Oscar Delp more involved in this offense, which I think has been one of the biggest surprises of this season, but you got a huge chunk play. And I think that definitely kind of got Texas on its heels where, not only did they overturn that penalty, Texas gets the ball, they score, I think, on the second play, and then Anthony Evans has that kick return that gets to the 10. I mean, Texas had all the momentum. Then you have that Arian Smith play and then that big Oscar Delp play, and I think that kind of calmed everybody down, at least on the Georgia side. Ben, what about you? What else stood out to you from this game? Anything that stuck with you in the days since?
Well, most of it, I would say, has already been covered up to this point, and it's probably a lot of rehashing of what we talked about in the post-game podcast as well. But I think, just looking at the drive chart, the Texas drive chart really tells the story of just how dominant this Georgia defense was in this one. I mean, it was punt. First half went punt, fumble, punt, interception, punt, fumble. The longest drive in that entire half was 26 yards. There were multiple drives that went negative in that half. There were multiple drives that went less than 10 yards in that half. I mean, Texas was struggling to just get any kind of first downs. And quite frankly, in the first half, most of the first down help that they got, or about half of the first down help that they got, was from Georgia penalties that resulted in automatic first downs. And so it was just a truly dominant defensive performance. I mean, even when you look at the second half, I mean, yes, Texas did have the 2 touchdown drives. One was 2 plays for 9 yards after the interception. The other one was the 8-play, 55-yard drive that they just almost had to have there in the second half. And credit to Texas. I mean, that was probably the one moment in the game where they said, if they don't score a touchdown on this drive, it is game over, by any measure. And they did drive down the field and scored. And that was a huge moment for them. And then, obviously they had the pick later on that resulted in the touchdown. But aside from that, in the second half, it was fumble, turnover on downs, turnover on downs, turnover on downs, turnover on downs. I mean, this was a team that was getting 4 downs on every single possession the entire second half, and they still really weren't making much of an impact moving the football outside of that one drive. So I think that we've pointed to a lot of the guys like Jalen Walker, obviously, Michael Williams being healthy makes a huge difference. I thought the linebackers, Raylan Wilson, CJ Allen, Chaz Chambliss, I thought had a really good game. They were all playing really, really well. Kip mentioned Kipp Adams. I think what was very interesting to me was there's been so much criticism of these cornerbacks this year, rightfully so in some cases. Dalen Everett early I think he might have had a pass interference penalty called on him early, and he might have gotten hit a couple of times in the passing game. And then he has the strip sack in recovery, and then he has the pick in the first half, and he was making these game-changing plays. Julian Humphrey wasn't perfect by any means in the Texas game, but one time Texas was backed up into its own end zone, and Quinn Ewers just kind of tries to take a shot down the field. It wasn't a great throw. Receiver contorts his body, makes a play with Julian Humphrey in coverage. Later on in that same drive was when Julian Humphrey jumps the ball on 4th down and makes the stop. So I just thought it was, you point to a lot of the guys up front and how dominant it felt like they were, and that was definitely helping the secondary on the back end probably have one of its better coverage games of the season. But I also thought that the guys that have been catching a lot of heat and criticism throughout the year for things that they may or may not have done, they really stepped up. And even within this own game where they had some issues or they had some moments where they weren't perfect, they rebounded. They were resilient. I think that was the phrase that Kirby Smart kept using post game, given the way that everything went with the penalty overturn, that the resilience that this team showed was really good. And I thought that the cornerbacks were a great representation of that, just because they were the only ones that really kind of got at any point during the game. And they immediately had an answer for that on both of their possessions. Julian Humphrey and Dalen Everett, both on both of their possessions where that happened. I mean, on the offensive side of the ball, I think, it was not a perfect football game on the offensive side. There's no doubt about that. I do wonder, without Trevor Etienne, what would this Georgia offense look like? Like, that is one of the more pivotal roster management moves that Georgia has made in a long time, in my opinion, just because he makes an impact in the running game, even when the blocking up front is not, exactly what you want it to be. They get him involved in the screen game, and he just is quick. He makes plays. He gets the tough yards. Like, he just does those types of things that you want. So I am curious where this Georgia offense would be without him. I do realize Kirby Smart, made the comments about the drops and the wide receivers, and that's definitely been an issue throughout this year. There's no denying that whatsoever. I will say, I feel like when I went back and did the rewatch, I really felt like there was only one offensive play in the entire game that Georgia absolutely had to have. And I thought it was that 3rd and 10 on their own 11 when it was 23-15. And Carson Beck steps up in the pocket and he hits Arian Smith, who runs a great route. He catches the ball with his hands. He gets some extra yards after the catch. And I think that it was just enough of a moment that Georgia needed. It was the deep breath that Georgia needed to say, all right, they've been dominating this game. They're still going to win this football game. But if that play does not happen, I don't know what the rest of this game looks like. And I think that for as many criticisms as you can have for the offense in this one, many of which are very, very fair, I think that the one play that they absolutely positively had to have, they had. I guess you could also make the case for the 4th down, Trevor Etienne actually punching it into the end zone. But considering he'd already actually scored on that possession, I hate to point to that one as like they had to have this one. But I think that Carson Beck to Arian Smith, I mean, for all the issues that they've had on that exact type of play, right? Like an intermediate passing route, got to have it situation, and they converted it. And so, again, it's never going to be perfect when you go on the road to play the number 1 team. Quarterback has 3 interceptions. You're struggling to run the ball at times. You're maybe even choosing not to run the ball in certain situations at times where people are so accustomed to Georgia running the ball. That's okay. Those are the things, to Kipp's point. I think that's the identity of this team. I think that's who it is. I think that's how they're going to call these games going forward. I think that's just what you can come to expect. But I think that having that 3rd and 10 conversion shows me that for all the flaws that there are on offense, like in the big moments, they can still make the plays that you got to make to be able to win when situations get tight. And they certainly did that throughout that one in Austin.
I wanted to hit on a few things, Ben, that you said. The Julian Humphrey play where he breaks up that pass, it comes like 2 plays after he got shook out of his shoes and gave up extra yards on a catch. So, I mean, credit to him there. Dalen Everett on the rewatch, the 2 turnovers he made, he does such a great job disguising what he's going to do. On that blitz where he forces the fumble, I mean, he looks like he's in man-to-man getting ready to follow that guy, and he doesn't give it away till the snap, and he takes off after Quinn Ewers and gets there. Did a great job there. And then on the interception, he looks like he's playing man, and as the play starts, he switches and kind of turns in a zone, lets the guy he was lined up against go behind him, and you could tell it just totally caught Quinn Ewers off guard, and he intercepted it. You can see how high the bar is and the standard for Kirby Smart, because he was asked about Dalen, and he's like, yeah, I mean, he made the pick, but it should have been a pick 6, I thought. And I was like, well, but he did give him some credit, but he didn't, he wasn't exactly singing his praises. But great game by Dalen. Jalen Walker played out of his mind. There was one play on one of the drives where Arch Manning was in where I think a little bit earlier in that drive, Arch had some success just taking off and running. And there's a play where Arch runs to the right to try to take off again. And I'm still amazed that Jalen caught him from where he was. I mean, he covered ground in a hurry. And Arch might have gained 3 or 4 yards, but it had the potential to be about a 15-yard run because there was a lot of space. I mean, just credit to that entire defense. Offense, Carson Beck didn't have his best night. I don't know if this bye week, which we'll talk about here in a second, will benefit anybody better than Carson Beck. Get some rest, try to clean things up. But again, a win's a win. And Ben, I thought, said it best on Saturday night. You go into Austin and win 30-15, you're going to take that no matter what. And I do want to point this out. I almost forgot. Brett Thorson, man, just continues to flip fields, plays great. I think I saw a stat today that he leads the nation in hang time. I mean, that he's going to be an NFL punter, and he deserves a lot of credit.
No doubt. I mean, I think I also saw a stat today that he has had 4 punts returned this year, which is more than he had last year, obviously with having 0. I think it's for a combined -9 yards, though. So I think that Georgia will take the 4 returns this season because it gave him a little bit better field advantage this year.
I also want to give credit to Bobo, not just for that flea flicker, the timing of it, but I mean, I know that he's been itching to do this for a while, but bringing back some fullback action. We saw like Jurasic's best blocking of the season, I thought, was him blocking out of the backfield from the fullback position, especially on a lot of pin and pull runs. So it was just it kind of like I had to laugh because I didn't really catch it live, but just seeing how many times they put him in at fullback and the success because he's caught some flack for his blocking throughout the season. So at the same time, he should be given the credit whenever he puts a hat on a hat. He actually does pretty well, especially, in motion in this game. So I think maybe, Bobo's finding ways to use the guys he had. And I think, that's something that moving forward, I think, the other teams are going to have to defend for it. But that's just more, that Georgia puts on film. The harder it's going to be for defenses to really predict what they're going to do. So I just think that some of those play calls have kind of opened things up for other plays for Georgia moving forward.
Jurasic deserves a lot of credit. I think he's gotten better as the season has gone. And 2, on Mike Bobo, I feel like they have done a very good job in these games of using motion early in the game. Like at one point, Dylan Bell had a jet sweep, and then you flash it later, and you don't go to it, but the defense is thinking, hey, we saw this earlier. I thought there was a good use of that in that Texas game. Well, guys, as I mentioned earlier, Georgia has an open date this week, no game, as they get ready for the Florida game next Saturday down in Jacksonville. We have not heard from Kirby Smart yet this week. We will hear from him on Tuesday night, and we will include clips from that in our Thursday podcast. But this is a very valuable week, and it's kind of funny. I keep feeling like the timing of Georgia's bye weeks has been really beneficial for this team, and I think this is another example. I mean, to have come off a really hard-fought Texas game, a very physical game, a game of a lot of ups and downs for Georgia. Ben, what do you want to hear out of this bye week for the Bulldogs? Just how valuable do you feel like the timing is on this and what they need to accomplish before we are talking about Georgia, Florida next week?
Well, it's crazy that we're already at the second bye week of the year. These seasons go so freaking fast. I think that timing of bye weeks there's always a good time for a bye week because I think that you can get a little bit healthy. I know that depending on how you ask Kirby Smart the question, he sort of says that bye weeks come at a good time, or he pushes back and says, well, we're not going to get any rest or get healthier or whatever. I'm sure that there are plenty of guys that need a little bit of extra rest that are going to be able to get that this week. I think that the 2 that come to mind are Jordan Hall and Tate Ratledge, who I was watching during pregame, and they were working with Scott Sinclair. And I think that you could notice a little bit of a limp or a hitch in their step or however you want to describe it with both of them. But they were both working very hard and moving fairly fluidly for guys that are trying to bounce back from injuries. I think that those are 2 in the trenches that Georgia would really like to see, be able to available and ready to play. I would guess at this point in time, and this is completely a guess, but I do think that both of those guys will be available and probably playing in some capacity in that game in Jacksonville. I know that's an important one for Jordan Hall, just being from his hometown. I thought that Jordan Hall was probably going to try and give it a go this week. So I think that, 2 weeks, that's probably what you're looking at. So I would say if we're talking about what are you looking out of the bye week, it's just sort of how does Kirby Smart talk about and describe some of those injuries and what their health looks like, just because I know he's never going to outright say, oh yeah, Jordan Hall is going to be playing 28 snaps against Florida. But I think that typically you can read between the lines on how he talks about certain injuries and get an idea of how it's going to be. And then hear behind the scenes, just the type of work that he's getting in practice that should give us a better idea. So those are the things that I'm probably looking at, just because, I think that Florida game's got a little bit more of a landmine to it than we probably all expected at the beginning of the season.
I would totally agree on the Florida standpoint. And yeah, with Tate Ratledge and Jordan Hall, and I think Jordan Hall might have been a little bit closer to actually playing in that Texas game. All in all, I think it was the best decision to hold those guys out. They're right there, give them another week, and then roll them out for the Florida game. What about you, Kip? What do you want to hear out of this bye week for Georgia? Things this team should accomplish before they jump back into it and then go nonstop until we get to December.
Yeah, I think Kirby would probably take the middle ground and tell you guys this is a work week and, not a bye week. So for them, it really is about looking ahead to the schedule. You got 4 teams now that, every one of those teams, you can't really say any team's a trap game. These are all teams that are going to test Georgia in different ways, especially, if you're missing key guys. There are matchups that can be exploited. So they have to continue working on getting better. For me, I kind of just want to see if they do the same thing I thought they might do during the first bye week, which is who are our 5 best offensive linemen? And if Tate is back, do you, again, think about putting Xavier Trust into their guard rotation, like making that an actual permanent thing? I think that Tate Ratledge is probably him and Jared Wilson being fully healthy. That's the key to Georgia's improved run blocking, because when we mentioned what Trevor Etienne's done this season, it's actually just truly impressive how patient he's had to be and the vision that he's displayed when there really haven't been some running lanes, and he is, meeting contact either at the line of scrimmage or sometimes behind it. So I do think that offensive line is a huge part of whether this offense can be more explosive, whether they can have more success. It's going to come down to, can we get more out of this run game, and can we protect Carson better? And so I still see plays, even, in the Texas game where, there were guys that were just not getting, a hat on a hat out there, not missing some blocks and making life tougher for whoever has the football for Georgia. So I still want to see, again, Trust has been there a long time. He's had some good plays where, he is out there and in motion and moving and pulling on blocks. But at offensive tackle, there's still been some times where, he just has not been able to get to the defender before they're completely back. He's whiffing, trying to get his hands on guys. So I do think that, you have to look at that and say, is there a better way to utilize what he brings to the table and who are our 5 best blockers? So that's still the thing for me. Otherwise, it's just about getting Jordan Hall back as well, because like I said earlier with that rotation, I think that having more guys in that defensive line rotation keeps those guys fresh. And I mean, this has the potential. It's going to be a longer season. Playing 15 games in the playoff before was already just a gauntlet. And now we're talking about adding, multiple rounds to that as well. 16, 17 games, basically an NFL season now. You got to keep these guys fresh, and playing 40 and 50 snaps a game on the defensive line. It's really not, it's going to be too much to ask of guys like Nazir Stackhouse and Warren Brinson to be able to do that every single week. And they don't have any breathers coming up. A lot of these teams are playing improved football right now, so you're going to have to ask more of these guys. So as many defensive linemen as you can get would do, a lot in helping them be fresh for the playoff.
You guys hit on the biggest ones for me between injuries and trying to get the offensive line shored up, especially in the run game. The biggest thing I would say other than that is I want to see if we hear from some of these other running backs behind Trevor Etienne, especially knowing that there's not a ton of options with both Robinsons banged up. And the guy I would just specifically say is Chauncey Bowens, who had missed that Mississippi State game, but was back on Saturday. I don't think he got any carries, but they're going to need other guys to take carries. And, Nate Frazier is very clearly the next guy up behind Etienne right now. But maybe seeing some more Chauncey Bowens, probably seeing some Cash Jones, especially in pass pro. They're going to need some more backs because, as Kip was just saying, it's a long season. And we know number one's really good. He may be the most talented offensive player on this offense, just with the way he's able to continue to make something out of nothing. But he can't do it by himself. They need some more help in the backfield. We're going to take a quick break, come back and talk about the state of the SEC right now, who is contending and the biggest threats to Georgia when it comes to getting to Atlanta in that SEC title game. I will also talk some recruiting news and intel, and then we'll finish things up with a little UGA hoops. All right, guys, let's talk about where things stand in the SEC. Several teams still in the hunt when it comes to that race to get to Atlanta. As folks may have forgotten, there's no divisions anymore, so top two teams get to go. Georgia is the only 4-1 team in conference play. Got Tennessee at 3-1 and a few teams down there at 2-1, but two undefeated teams in SEC play right now. Texas A&M at 4-0 in SEC play, LSU 3-0, and then you've got Georgia sitting in third. So, Ben, I'll start with you. Who do you see as the top competition for Georgia when it comes to this race to Atlanta? Who sticks out to you as the teams that are going to have the best shot at making this run to the SEC title game?
Well, for me, it comes down to a couple of games and matchups. Like, it's less so which teams specifically do I think are the best teams or the two best teams out of that group, but looking forward at the schedules and how things are shaking out. I mean, this weekend, obviously, LSU and Texas A&M are playing. They're the only two undefeateds left in the conference. I think that is a massive game, because not saying that either one of those teams, has a cakewalk in, but I think that if Texas A&M wins that one, I think that they're going to be favored in every game except for the Texas game to end the year. And so I think that there's a realistic possibility that if they do that and they get to that Texas game and lose to Texas, I mean, I don't know how the tiebreakers and everything would shake out and all of that would work. Obviously, there's a lot of other games that would have to play out, but there's a realistic chance that you could have a Texas A&M 2 weeks in a row matchup where Texas wins the first one and then they go and they play in Atlanta, just depending on how those tiebreakers play out. So I think that LSU winning that one this weekend will go a long way, because there's just not as many, to me, road bumps. I mean, LSU's still got Alabama. They've got to go on the road to Florida, which I don't think is going to be an easy one. You can't just overlook Vanderbilt at this point, though you would think by that point in the season that surely Vanderbilt won't have just been catching every single team along the way. So I think that those two teams, that matchup this weekend goes a long way. Obviously, the Georgia-Tennessee game. I mean, I think that the Georgia-Tennessee game, the winner of that game, again, depending on how other things play out and tiebreakers and things like that are able to shake out, the winner of that game is going to be sitting in a pretty comfortable spot, assuming that they win out the rest of their games. And then, like I already mentioned, that Texas A&M game, let's say Texas A&M loses this weekend to LSU, that Texas A&M game becomes massive at the end of the year, because that could be a winner gets into Atlanta and the loser goes to 2 losses and isn't in Atlanta, and now they're having to kind of leave some things up to chance when it comes to committee fate and things like that. So I realized that those are the teams that I think you look at and say those are the teams that have the best chance to get to Atlanta, looking at their schedule and looking at their records right now and looking forward to how things look. It is wild to me that I did that whole exercise and did not say Alabama one time, but it just feels to me like, they need They need a lot of stuff to happen for them to be able to be back in the conversation for playing in Atlanta. And they also cannot afford to lose another game, probably to even make the playoff at all. So, and they're probably already scratching and clawing for that positioning as it is. So, those are the teams that I look at, and those are the games, those matchups specifically, that I think will determine what Atlanta looks like in December.
Yeah, I think the greatest blessing for Georgia in where it stands right now is that Alabama has dropped 2 conference games, because basically Georgia controls its own destiny, at least when it comes to Alabama. If you lose another game and all of a sudden you're in a situation where you're losing the tiebreaker to Alabama because of the head-to-head, well, that's on you. You know what I mean? You can't really say, well, we should have been. It's like, well, Alabama lost 2 games after playing you, so you sort of knew the stakes. I would say the 2 teams, to me, from what I've seen, LSU or Texas, I think are the top contenders. I think A&M's got a chance, but I give LSU the edge going into this game in College Station. I've been really impressed with Garrett Nussmeier. He's got an argument to have been the best SEC quarterback so far this season. And when I look at a game where I kind of struggle with a pick, I go with who I think is playing better at quarterback, and I give LSU the edge. And then Texas, again, I think that A&M game is kind of that last sort of beacon of, all right, we're going to be challenged, ignoring or overlooking this week's trip to Nashville when Diego Pavia is going to have some say. But no, I mean, I think it's Texas or LSU. I think Alabama needs too much to find a way in. Still not convinced with Tennessee and the fact that game's in Knoxville. I mean, that game is in Athens when they play Georgia. I think that's a huge boost for Georgia. So I look at Texas and LSU, and we'll learn, like Ben said, a lot more about that standing this weekend when LSU plays at A&M. Kipp, what about you? What do you make of where Georgia is in this race and who you see as the top competition when it comes to getting to Atlanta?
Yeah, for Georgia, this Tennessee game is obviously going to say a lot, assuming that, Georgia comes out of Jacksonville with a win as well. And that's kind of where I can't stop thinking about the fact that, did we expect Billy Napier to be coaching Florida in this game? I mean, I think that's kind of the biggest surprise as far as his teams that, everyone wrote off at the beginning of the season because you can't really start out much poorly than Florida did. I mean, I guess they're not even the worst start in the state of Florida this season, obviously with the Seminoles. But I just think that, that's a team that everyone would put at the very bottom of the misery index a couple weeks ago. And now I'm still back to wondering, okay, does Kirby Smart put Jaden Rashada out in the field again? That's like, are we going to see a Billy Napier coaching against Jaden Rashada? And I just didn't expect that to even be part of the discussion heading into this bye week. But really, yeah, I mean, I think you have to look at the LSU Texas A&M game. That's probably the game that I think Texas and Alabama are above, more Texas and Alabama that we're watching and saying, all right, I mean, we need some help here. And if we're going to control our own destiny, we have to, I guess, maybe root for Texas A&M to win that game. And then, knowing that we have Texas A&M at the end of the season, knowing that, LSU just has, Alabama after that game, and knowing that, Tennessee can even kind of sit back, even if they lose to Georgia. As far as the playoffs are concerned, that's it as for teams that they're going to play with a winning record the rest of the season. Even if they lose to Georgia, I think they're sitting at a likely 10-2 and in the playoff scenario for them. So they're in a great position right now where I think a week ago they were wondering, where is this Josh Heupel offense that we were told about? And now it's kind of I think we're sitting pretty good as far as getting to the playoffs are concerned, even if we might not win the SEC this year.
Name one time that Tennessee has been sitting good in the playoff hunt and managed to blow it. I can't seem to think of one time that's happened.
I am going to actually stick up for Tennessee, though. They have not given up 20 points yet this season. And I think that if you have not given up 20 points yet this season, you are going to be competitive in every single football game that you play. So does that, guarantee them getting into the playoff? No, but I think that it does give them a better shot of playing well against Georgia than any year in the past.
Counterpoint to that with the offense, and this is just a stat that they threw up on the screen during that game on Saturday. 0 points in the first half in their last 3 games. That's the first time Tennessee has done that since 1963. And Think about, there's been some bad Tennessee football since the turn of the century. That offense, man, it's just so hit or miss. All right, Ben, there was something that we didn't talk about on Saturday night. I don't know how this would have slipped my mind. There was nothing else going on the recruiting front, and it was Jared Curtis, the 2026 quarterback, decommitting from Georgia. Ben, what can you tell us on that situation, and what's next for Jared Curtis?
Well, we got so caught up in the good news of talking about Elijah Griffin committing to Georgia that we forgot to talk about the bad news that happened the day before that. And like you mentioned, number 1 quarterback Jared Curtis decommits from Georgia. Surprising in the timing. I mean, it happened all pretty quickly. He called Kirby Smart and Mike Bobo the day that he ended up announcing things publicly. I had heard or gotten a text earlier in the day saying like, hey, I don't think Jared Curtis is locked in. And I was kind of like, what in the world's going on? I'm traveling to Austin, Texas right now. Like, wait, I'm expecting Elijah Griffin to commit tomorrow. Like, I was not preparing for this, quarterback drama to unfold on this Thursday. So I was a little bit surprised, but it, at least gave us a heads up to get things going on it. But I think that the big thing for me is, when he committed in the spring, it was a little bit surprising, the timing of it too. You knew that he was coming in on the visit. You knew that Georgia was probably the favorite or the top contender to land him. But when he came in on that spring practice visit, even his quarterback trainer at the time said to me, I was a little surprised that he did it as early as he did. Well, he was planning on waiting and being a little bit more patient. But I think sometimes you get caught up in those things. And sometimes when a program like Georgia and the relationships that you have with Kirby Smart and Montgomery Van Gorder and Mike Bobo and some of the people on the team is so strong, like, okay, yeah, I'll jump on board and I'll do it. And then you get into the season, you start taking some visits and you realize, everybody was right. I probably did commit too early, and I want to take these visits where I'm not committed somewhere else, where I, when I go visit Oregon or Auburn or Tennessee or Alabama or Ohio State or wherever it is that he ends up going, that those people are able to recruit him in a way where they know he's not locked down with Georgia and he can actually get recruited the way that he wants to get recruited. Not the best news for Georgia. They will be fine. They will continue to recruit Jared Curtis. I expect him to be at the Georgia-Tennessee game in November. They're going to be in the mix until the end. I never feel super optimistic when a guy decommits and then expecting him to ultimately recommit. I don't think that happens very often. But then, as I said on the Junkyard last week, I say all of that, and I think that that's what's going to happen with Justice Terry within this recruiting cycle that we're in right now. So every situation is a little bit different, but I wouldn't expect Jared Curtis to end up at Georgia at this time, but I do think he's going to visit Georgia multiple times. I would be willing to guess, probably somewhat depending on when he actually makes his announcement, but I would guess he takes an official visit or something like that next summer at some point to Georgia, depending on what direction Georgia goes at quarterback. I will note, unrelated to Jared Curtis entirely, but somewhat, Georgia did throw out a quarterback offer last night to a 2025 quarterback. As you know, they've already got a 2025 quarterback committed in Ryan Montgomery. He has a torn ACL, so he hasn't been able to play during his senior season. We know that the scholarship counter is possibly going from 85 to 105. And so Georgia's trying to figure out, what does that mean for all of their positional numbers? I think that quarterback's one where we've always heard, all right, 4 is the number. Is it possible that 5 is the number? Is it possible that Georgia's preparing for some movement out of the quarterback room, or potentially some transfer movement into the quarterback room? Or do they just want to stick status quo and build it up to 5 and, have the guys that they already have on campus and then add the 225s and then figure 26 out from there? But, I found that interesting. I'm not even, and I hate to do it, he's committed to Cal right now. His name's Jaron. I don't want to butcher his other 2 names. He's from Hawaii, which tells me right there he's a really good quarterback. Just the fact that he's a top 10 quarterback in the country from Hawaii. But again, I will get a pronunciation guide on the rest of his name so that I don't butcher it in future episodes. But that's definitely something to tuck away for later. I think that quarterback, defensive line, linebacker, defensive back are all position groups where you're probably going to see the class grow in the 2025 class, but also, you're going to, they're going to have to figure out what they want to do with the 85 and 105. And I think there's a lot of fringe guys at every single one of those positions that could or could not be in that class. So I realized that was a little bit of a divergence from the Jared Curtis stuff, but just knowing that they threw out a quarterback offer in the 2025 class tells me that they were prepared for this as a possibility. And as we all know, Georgia is scouting quarterbacks down to like the craziest degree that you could ever imagine. Like, we know the guys that they end up offering. We know the guys that end up entering the transfer portal that they end up taking a look at and things like that. But it goes so much deeper than that in terms of what this personnel department is taking a look at and the quarterbacks that they're taking, looking at. Like, again, this Cal quarterback was not on my radar whatsoever. And now he's catching a 2025 offer in late October. So again, Georgia is doing its due diligence very much so at the quarterback position right now.
Kipp, how much concern do you think Georgia fans should have about the future of the position given Jared Curtis's decommitment?
I mean, all it means is that as of right now, these two parties aren't connected. I think we're talking about the next cycle That is more of a spring situation typically with quarterbacks. The fact that he committed to Georgia early just meant that he committed to Georgia early, and that's what he admitted. I think for Mike Bobo, his evaluation process is going to continue, and I don't think that position is going to be a huge issue in Georgia's offense moving forward. I think, again, we just talked about how they are throwing the ball 40 times a game right now. They're coming off a season where they led the SEC in passing yards. I don't think quarterbacks are looking at Georgia and going, I don't know if I'm going to be able to put up numbers there. And so I think for Georgia, it is going to be just about continuing the evaluations. I mean, we can all acknowledge NIL as part of the process, but it's not like Georgia didn't just put a huge NIL package in to bring back a quarterback that people thought was going to go in the first round. The NIL is there. It's not going to be an issue for Georgia at any point as far as that quarterback room is concerned. It just means with this specific recruitment, he just opened it up. I don't think this is a black eye on Georgia quarterback recruiting so much as it's just parties moving on, or him reopening things, other teams getting involved, like Oregon. That's the team that we're hearing the most right now with Jared Curtis, but he's going to go back through the process. And so, I mean, we're not going to close the door on Georgia being involved in his recruitment. They're going to get him back on campus again, most likely. As of now, it could still change. And so I think it's kind of just a blip in the recruiting cycle where, okay, you want to keep going, evaluating other programs. We're going to keep evaluating the quarterback position for your cycle. We're also probably going to bring in another quarterback in the 2025 cycle. With the expanding of the roster, it seems like that's going to be the way they go. And let's not forget, the transfer portal is still going to exist there. That's still going to be a possibility. It's one that Georgia's already used this past cycle. So I think it happens. It happens in recruiting all the time. It's going to get a lot of pub because it's a highly rated quarterback. But other than that, I don't think this is anything for Georgia fans to really lose a lot of sleep over.
As always, be sure to stay glued to Dawgs247.com. Ben and Kipp will have you covered when it comes to what's going on in recruiting and with Georgia's plans at the position going forward. Georgia men's basketball minute, quite a bit to get to. Georgia had an exhibition at Charlotte on Saturday, won 86-59. Really good showing from several Bulldogs, including freshman Asa Newell. Very impressive. I guess you'd call it a debut. It was just a scrimmage, but a good showing against the 49ers. And then shout out to Mike White and company on Monday. They really opened the doors for the media, held a film session for us to watch some of the highlights and I guess the lowlights from that Charlotte game, really things that they are focused on cleaning up before they play another scrimmage next week at home against UCF. Then we were able to watch all of practice. I wrote about 2,000 words on what we saw both from film and from that practice session. From the practice, super impressed by Asa Newell. He looks the part of a five-star, just moves so effortlessly. Was throwing down a one-handed dunk at one point, hit, I think, a couple of threes while we were out there. I mean, I was impressed by what I saw. Silas Demery, I thought that he looked like his shot has improved. Toward the end of practice, they had some 5-on-5 work where there was one period where it was 10 minutes of play, and then there was another that was sort of like an end-of-game situation where they're trying to come back. And between those two, Silas had 12 points and was shooting really well from three. RJ Godfrey, the Clemson transfer, really like what he brings to this team. Blue Kane, I thought, showed that he's become more of a complete all-around player. Really good on defense, did a good job tracking down rebounds. And then the guy I'll tell you guys to keep an eye out for, that's probably more so even for years going forward because he's not going to be with the team until the middle of December, but Deshane Montgomery. Deshane, he reminds me, I think it was Dogs HQ's Palmer Toms compared him to KD Johnson. I mean, he's got some fire. He was doing a lot of trash talking with his teammates, with one of the staffers on the side. He was getting after it. He was getting rebounds. He was talking his team up. I really like that Deshane Montgomery addition from Mount St. Mary's. And, I had this team finishing 9th in the SEC, which I think is enough to make the NCAA tournament. It was just one practice. There's a long way to go. But I feel pretty good about my prediction. This team's making the tournament. I think it's obvious this team is better. The thing that some of us talked about from the jump, just looking at them on the court, significantly better. I should say significantly bigger and probably better, but significantly bigger than the team last year. Just a ton of size, a ton of very obvious length. I think that's something that Mike White hasn't had enough of since he's been in Athens. I think they've done a good job building this roster, and I think it's going to be a very fun team to follow. All right, we are going to wrap up the episode there. I'll tell everybody to keep an eye out. On Thursday, we will have another podcast where we will have clips of what Kirby Smart and some of the players had to say during this bye week. And then we'll also take a look back at our stat over-unders from before the season, see which ones we look like we're on track to hit, and maybe discuss some of the ones we missed. But a lot of content still this week with it being a bye week. Encourage you guys to keep an eye out for my rewatch story. That'll go up Tuesday afternoon. And then another UGA Hoops note to keep an eye out if you're watching this live. I think in about an hour or so that Mike White and company is going to get some good news on the recruiting trail. So put that out there as well. Be sure to go subscribe to Dawgs 24/7. Go to the YouTube, subscribe, the TikTok. A lot of good content there, and we will keep it going through the rest of this season. So we'll wrap it up right there. For Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.